Chapter 19 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Davis. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 19. Bach and Aesthetics. We argue about absolute music, tone painting, program music, and tone language as about actual fundamental problems, and think it a matter for historians only that tendencies toward tone painting, program music, or avowed musical narration were noticeable in Italian, German, and French music as early as the 17th and 18th centuries. However primitive the pictorial and poetic music of the 2 or 3 generations before Bach may have been, in respect of their means and possibilities of expression, we can see in it the same instincts and pretensions as in the most modern and most subtilized program music of a Liszt or Strauss. This old art, however, was not wholly primitive. It may be possible to regard Froberger, Kuhnau, and the composers of the Italian and French character pieces as simply naive painters in music who overstepped the bounds of pure music without realizing all the bearings of what they were doing. But the composers for the Hamburg Theatre knew what they wanted. Music, in their eyes, was a representation of actions, scenes, and ideas. They thought themselves capable of expressing everything in tone. Matheson even gives recipes for the clear and correct expression of the emotions in music. In a cantata of 1744 for the 8th Sunday after Trinity, Telemann represents the false prophets in sheep's clothing by a complete circle of fists through all the 12 major scales. Here the symbolism is rather metaphysical, but there are many other passages in Telemann that are admirable in their pictorial purpose and achievement. The music among which Bach grew up, whose full unfolding he was able to witness, and whose consummation he is, took for itself by preference the title of expressive, affektvoll, in distinction from all others, meaning to indicate thereby that its purpose was graphic characterization and realism. Although our musical aestheticians have known this, for the histories of music testify sufficiently to it, they make no attempt to examine the music of that epoch thoroughly and to inquire what light it might throw on the nature of the art, but took the line of sweeping aside these phenomena as merely transitory pathological perversions of pure music. Bach proves himself an exponent of the affektvoll music of his epoch by the Capriccio, the programmed sonata on the departure of his brother. Instead of asking themselves, however, whether the same spirit cannot be detected in his later music, the aestheticians choose to regard the Capriccio as an interesting indiscretion of his youth, with which he paid his tribute to his epoch, and which we can forgive him in consideration of the pure music of the preludes and fugues. But they omitted to analyze the music he wrote in conjunction with poetry in the chorales, cantatas, and passions, and to ask whether the pictorial tendencies of contemporary music may not be found in Bach also. Only one of the musical aestheticians, Mosvius, had tried to comprehend Bach's art as the art of characteristic musical representation. He had, however, no successor. His book Johann Sebastian Bach in seinen Kirchen Kantaten, 1845, although it is cited here and there, did not exercise the slightest influence on Bach research. From the second half of the 19th century onward, when the struggle over modern music began, men's views upon Bach were not so unprejudiced as those of Mosvius. It was admitted, of course, that there were some curious things in his works. Now and then it had to be admitted that the imitative or pictorial purpose was quite obvious. For instance, in the chorale Durch Adams Fall ist ganz verderb, B, number 13, where the fall of Adam is suggested by falling sevenths in the bass, or in an aria in Hercules am Scheidewege, where the music depicts the serpents mentioned in the text, and where there are other striking examples of the same kind. If anyone noticed such a case, he thought it his duty to represent it as quite without significance, so as not to injure the reputation Bach had achieved as a classical composer, and to save him from the suspicion of having done anything to pervert pure music into representative music. Spitta took care that no one should be misled by this or that piece of characterization into doubting for a moment that Bach was a priest of absolute music, or should fail to get the right conception of his art. When he came to what seemed to him a particularly dangerous place in a cantata, he thought it as well to protect humanity, as it were, by putting a fence round it. Ready as Bach was, he says at one point, to sprinkle his works with picturesque figures, he did not do so as a result of fundamental principles based on a sense of the graphic power of music. Those figures are transient flashes, and their presence or absence cannot alter the value or intelligibility of the composition in its integrity. In studying Bach, when we meet with some conspicuously melodious line or some strikingly harmonious tune that happens to coincide with an emphatic or emotional word, we are too ready to attribute them to a much closer and deeper connection than can ever have dwelt in the purpose of the composer. This citation is typical of Spitta's point of view. His analysis, in other respects so wonderful and penetrating, failed just at the point where he should look for the inmost connection between the poetic thought and Bach's musical expression. The many striking instances of tone painting do not impel him to inquire whether other characteristic themes and figures are not also prompted by the pictures and ideas suggested in the text, and whether Bach's Stimmung is not so much a generalized emotional state as one woven out of concrete musical ideas. He could not see the possibility of the text being reflected in the music as in clear running water. He wishes to guard against it being thought too characteristic. So Spitta regards the coincidence of strikingly expressive themes or figures with characteristic or expressive words as mostly accidental, and warns us against attributing to them a much closer and deeper connection than can ever have dwelt in the purpose of the composer. Thus, in order to prove that Bach's music was not materialistic, the most remarkable feature of his work has to be explained as a kind of musical accident. It reminds us of the famous Dutch philosopher Geulincx, whose dread of philosophical materialism was so great that he would not admit any influence of the thought and the will upon the movements of the limbs, and held that God had regulated the body and the soul like two absolutely parallel pieces of clockwork, so that the same thing would always happen at precisely the same time in the corporeal sphere and in the spiritual. Thus, what seemed explicable from the external standpoint, only by a direct connection of the two, was really the coincidence, predestined from eternity, of a mental idea and a bodily movement. In the same way, Spitta's dread of musical materialism absolved him from the necessity of a careful inquiry into the connection of word and tone in Bach by a few authoritative dicta upon the true nature of the art. With his La question ne sera pas posée, he tries to scare off anyone who would like further information as to Bach's attitude toward his texts, a question of interest for the understanding not only of Bach's work, but the nature of music in general. We can partly comprehend this point of view, for the architectonic and contrapuntal perfection of his works gives such deep and pure satisfaction to the mind that appreciates these purely musical qualities of them, that almost everything else that could be found in them must seem of secondary importance. In Spitta, too, there was the instinctive fear that Bach might be pressed into the service of a certain kind of modern pictorial music that was anathema to him and his adherents. He was partly influenced also by a justifiable dislike for the kind of superficial modernization of the old music that sometimes takes the place of thorough research, and prides itself on bringing the old masters nearer to our own time. Thus Bach's cantatas were issued, year after year, just at the time when Wagner and Berlioz were setting musicians by the ears, and no one perceived what treasures in the way of dramatic and pictorial music were hidden in the big gray volumes, and what vistas they opened out to musical aesthetics. Today it is still a reproach to our aestheticians, even the best of them, that they know nothing of the 200 Bach cantatas, and but a few of the organ chorales. The extraordinarily expressive and pictorial conception of music that these works reveal have exercised no influence whatever on the ordinarily accepted or debated theories of the nature of music. One would have thought that the most pressing duty of aesthetics was to study the latest discoveries, searching in them for light on the basic problem of all music, the question of the nature of thematic invention. The attraction was truly great enough, for one had only to read through 5 or 6 volumes of the cantatas to be struck, more than happens in the case of any other music, by certain recurring singularities, inner affinities, variants of the same theme, and some inexplicable bizarrities. What an enigma is offered to us by the themes of the St. Matthew Passion alone! Think of the joyous writing in Judah's air of contrition, Geb mir meinen Jesum wieder, give me my dear Lord beloved, of the wild 2-part flute accompaniment in the bass arioso, Ja freilich will in uns das Fleisch und Blut zum Kreuz gezwungen sein. Aye, surely now can flesh and blood atone. Of the shapelessness, so senseless from the musical point of view, of the theme of the aria, Können Tranen meine Wange nichts erlangen, though in vain be all my wailing, of the remarkable affinity between certain ariosos and the arias that follow them, in short, of all the things that surprise the musician the more he studies the work, that become, to his sorrow, more and more inexplicable to him, and which he does not know how to perform, for the meaning of them is unknown to him, until he guesses this music is not self-extant, but has sprung from some strong external force that will not obey the laws of harmonious thematic structure. Aesthetics, however, lost this chance of being, for once, directly helpful to practical art. It passed by almost unregardingly the singular problem presented by the motives of the passions, the cantatas, and the chorale preludes, and had no perception that this classical master probably had something like a definite musical language of his own, in which ideas struggled for concrete expression. On the other hand, the artists who worked at the cantatas had an intuition of where the key to this music was to be sought. Their practical experiences brought them many a surprising discovery, but they failed to correlate their knowledge, of which they spoke in vague terms and mostly among themselves, their chief concern being to let the works speak for themselves by bringing out correct editions of them. We thus have a musical aesthetic in which Bach has not had his say. Statistics of the number of times his name appears in works dealing with the nature of music would leave us very disappointed. Even in so thorough a treatise as Cambarot's Le rapport de la musique et de la poésie, Bach hardly plays any part. The French author has this excuse, that he had not a sufficiently intimate knowledge of German to enable him to fathom the Bach of the cantatas. The German aestheticians, however, go no more thoroughly into his works. This is due not only to the fact that Bach is as yet really very little known, but to the whole character of our investigations into the nature of music. Our aestheticians do not set out from the works of art themselves. They usually stop just where music begins. Schopenhauer, Lotz, and Helmholtz occupy a much larger place in their studies than Bach, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Berlioz, and Wagner. In the aesthetic treatise that deal with painting, we find a much more thorough aesthetic of the artworks than in those devoted to music. Therefore, we need not wonder that musical aesthetic stands perplexed before the problems that actual music presents to it. At the end, when all the theories derived from definitions and from the physiology of sound have been properly dealt with, the real problems of music, tone painting, descriptive music, program music, the cooperation of music with the other arts, are polished off in a few supplementary words. End of chapter 19.